students, my name is Niyati Seth and thanks for watching Wikipedia word videos. My topic for the presentation is the second section of the chapter Neural Control and Coordination. In this section of presentation, we'll be studying about the transmission of nerve impulse. That means how the information is traveled from one neuron to the another neuron. Okay, so transmission of nerve impulse. Nerve impulse, they have a domino effect. Now what do you mean by domino effect? That it receives an impulse and then it transmits that impulse to next neuron. Okay, I have already taught you how the signal is being transmitted from one neuron to another neuron in my previous section of the presentation. So please refer to that presentation. Now we'll see how the event of, or you can say the chain of chemical events take place in the transmission of nerve impulse. Okay, through a chain of chemical events, the dendrites, they pick up an impulse. I have already taught you how dendrites, they pick up an impulse that is shuttled or that is traveled through the axon and transmitted to the next neuron. Okay, so there is a chemical event chain takes place which consists of 5 steps. So in this, what happens is the entire impulse, they passes through a neuron in about 7 milliseconds, which is faster than a lightning strike. Just imagine. So here what happens in just 5 easy steps? What happens first is polarization of neurons membrane. This is the first step that takes place when transmission of information takes place from one neuron to another. Okay, so polarization of neuron membrane is the first step. In this, what happens is the sodium is on the outside and potassium is on the inside. That means this is the membrane of the neuron. Okay, this purple color is the neuron membrane. So what happens is sodium goes on outside and potassium goes on inside. Now what does polarization means? Being polarized means that the electrical charge on outside of the membrane is positive. Okay, while electrical charge on inside of the membrane is negative. That means between these two membranes, this is the membrane of the neuron. So between the membrane or between the space, there should be a negative electrical charge, whereas on outside of this it should be positive. So this becomes polarized. Okay, the outside of the cell contains excess sodium ions. See, sodium ions, excess of it, and inside of the cell contains excess potassium ion. That means potassium ion is inside and sodium ion is outside. Then that is known as polarization of neuron membrane, which is known as the first step of the transmission of nerve impulse. When a neuron is not stimulated, it's just sitting with no impulse to carry or transmit, then its membrane is polarized. That means when the neuron is on the resting position, or you can say that when the neuron is not stimulated by any electrical stimuli, then that step is known as polarization. In this, positive ions, they remain outside and negative, they remain inside. Okay, then that membrane is known as polarization and it is just sitting with no impulse to carry or transmit, or you can say that it is in the resting position. Okay, now The second step in the transmission of nerve impulse is resting potential gives the neuron a break. What does it mean? When a neuron is inactive and polarized, polarized means positive ions outside the membrane and negative electrical charge is inside the membrane, then the membrane is known as polarized. So when the neuron is inactive and polarized, it is said to be at its resting potential. It remains this way until a stimulus comes along. That means it remains as it is until and unless stimulates comes along and stimulates it. Okay, so this is how the section of the axon during resting potential. Resting potential is a step just below your first step, that is when membrane is polarized, okay, in which positive electrical charge are outside and negative electrical charges are inside, okay, as you can see in this diagram. So it remains as it is until a stimulus comes and stimulates it. So you can say that resting potential, it gives neuron a break time, okay. Now the third is action potential. Action potential, you can say that sodium ions, they move inside the membrane. See, as you can see, sodium ion till now, till second step, sodium ions were outside the membrane and potassium ions were inside the membrane. But when action potential comes into being, then sodium ions, they start to migrate inside the membrane cell, okay. And what does action potential means? When a stimulus reaches a resting neuron, that means a neuron when it is in the resting condition, or a resting potential when a neuron takes a break, and when stimulus comes or reaches a resting neuron, then the gated ion channels on the resting neuron membrane open suddenly and they allow Na plus ions inside that were outside of the membrane. So they start to rush into the cell. These are the gated ion channels. This is a gated ion channel which is in the closed condition, but now it is open. So and all the Na plus ions, they starts to migrate inside the membrane cell. As this happens, a neuron goes from being polarized to being depolarized. Now neuron is no longer polarized, okay, it has converted into depolarized. Polarization is removed and threshold is reached, okay. As soon as polarization is removed, threshold is reached. Each neuron has a threshold level, the point at which there is no holding back. That means no sodium ion is left outside the membrane, all are inside the membrane. Then that level is known as threshold level. After the stimulus goes above the threshold level, more gated ion channels, they open and they allow more Na plus inside the cell. Okay, as the stimulus goes above the threshold, that means a stimulus has to have go beyond the threshold level. For that, these gated ion channels, they become active and they allow more ion inside the cell, and this causes complete depolarization of the neuron and the action potential is created. Okay, this is how the depolarization of the neuron takes place, and this is how action potential is generated. Okay, and after complete depolarization is done, then only stimulus will be transmitted to another neuron. Okay, so action potential should be generated for the transmission of the nerve impulse from one nerve to another, or you can say that then only it can transmit the information from one neuron to another. Okay, Now fourth steps comes into being. In this, what happens is repolarization is being done. See, in the first step, polarization was done. Second step, resting potential was there. And now the third was when the depolarization was done. Now fourth step is repolarization. That means potassium ion, now they move outside, and the sodium ions, they stay inside the membrane. Because in the third step we just saw that sodium ions, they starts to rush inside the membrane, but the space is limited. So what will potassium ion will do? Potassium ion, they will move outside, and this process is known as repolarization. Okay, and these are the gated ion channels which are specific for sodium ions. Okay, after the inside of the cell becomes flooded with the Na+, as I have told you that Na+ ions in the third step, they just come inside or they just rush inside the membrane. So inside of the cell, they become flooded with the Na+ ion. Now the gated ion channels on inside of the membrane, they open to allow K+ ion to move to outside of the membrane. Okay, just after the K+ gates open, the Na+ gates, they close. Okay, they just close. Otherwise, membrane could not be repolarized, because for the repolarization to occur, your K+ should go out and Na+ should remain inside the membrane. Okay. Now the fifth steps come into being. This step is known as refractory period. In this, everything goes back to normal. It returns to its original position. That means K+ they return inside and sodium they return outside. Okay. The refractory period is when Na+ and K+ are returned to their original sites. That means original home for Na+ was outside the membrane and original home for K+ is inside the membrane. Okay, so the refractory period is when Na+ and K+ are returned to their original sites. Na+ on outside and K+ on inside. This was the main you can say statement which it was in previous step. Okay, so while neuron is busy returning everything to normal, it doesn't respond to any incoming stimulus. Okay, so please note that while neuron is busy returning everything to normal, in that event of time, it doesn't respond to any incoming stimuli. Okay, after Na+ and K+ pumps return the ions to the rightful side of the neuron cell membrane, neuron is back to its normal polarized state. When I say refractory period means returning back to the polarized state, which was the first step of the transmission of the nerve impulse. Okay, so it becomes polarized. Polarized means Na+ ions they move outside and K+ ions they move inside. Okay, which they return to their original sites or original home. After Na+ and K+ pumps return the ions to the rightful side of the neuron cell membrane, the neuron is back to its normal polarized state and stays in the resting potential until another impulse comes along. And what is the second step of nerve impulse? That is resting potential. So it remains in the resting potential until another impulse comes along, and then all the chain of event of transmission of nerve impulse takes place again, or you can say that this cycle goes on and on and on. Okay, so this is see what happens in polarization, depolarization and repolarization. Polarization, K plus ion, they leak from the neuron and they determine resting membrane potential. Whereas depolarization means Na plus ions, they rushes inside the membrane. Okay, and what does repolarization mean? Repolarization, in this K plus ion, they rush out. Okay, see, this is the graph of how sodium channels they open, close, or how the potassium channels they open and close with the chemical event of the transmission of nerve impulse. See, this is the graph which we plotted against the voltage and the time. So in the polarized state, when the sodium channels they open, and then in the depolarized state when they close, or you can say that this is the potential of the sodium ion channels when they are open, and this is the sodium channel when it is closed, when the gated sodium ion channels are closed, and this is done in the depolarization state. And then repolarization takes place, in which potassium ion channels they just open as to allow K plus ion inside the resting potential, and Na plus is thrown outside the membrane so that they can again become polarized, and they remain in the resting potential, so that until and unless electrical impulses or electrical stimuli is created. Okay, so this is how the graph is drawn between potential and the time. And this was all about the transmission of the nerve impulse. In my next section of the presentation, we'll be studying about the myelinated axon sheet and non-myelinated axon sheet. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Edupedia Word videos.